Hello and welcome to Chess with Simon. I'm Simon. Today we're going to continue looking at the games of Ray Keene. So in the first of this series we looked at a triumph of modernism by Ray, and this game is a triumph over modernism. So he's playing against Daniel King, the British Grandmaster who's done so much to popularise chess, and Ray is playing black. And this is a fascinating game. So in this game, Ray shows a good strategy against the King's Indian attack, which is a kind of modern style opening. And also, there's a beautiful tactical conclusion to this game. It's also strategically pretty deep. So knight f3 from Danny, knight f6 from Ray, g3 from Danny. So this is the modernist conception, developing the bishop in the flank, but not staking a claim in the centre. Ray plays d5, bishop g2, and then this c6 move is very interesting. There's a lot to say about this. So White is playing the King's Indian attack. The King's Indian defence is a dynamic black opening that is preferred by players who like to counter-attack. So people reasoned that if it's good with the black pieces, it must be even better with the white pieces, where White has an extra tempo. This is true, but Ray is playing a line with black that's not available to White, because usually White would go d4 and then knight f6 and then c4 and then g6 and knight c3. So the white pawn is on c4. In this case, Ray has moved the pawn only one square, which allows him to support the centre, play very solidly, and just blunt the action of that bishop on the light square diagonal. This is sort of a relative of the Caro-Kann defence, really. d3 from Danny, which is a standard move. Bishop g4. Now, Ray makes the point that you can also play bishop f5 here. Actually, I'm in a correspondence tournament around that position at the moment. You can play bishop f5 here. Bishop g4 is a good move, and it slightly tempts White to start pushing the bishop around with h3 and g4. White develops the knight naturally on d2. Black also developing the knight in a similar way. The idea here is to support e5 and then bring the bishop harmoniously to the d6 square, which is also supporting e5. White castles, black gets e5 in. So White plays e4. So really in these King's Indian systems, well, King's Indian reversed, you're usually aiming to play either e4 or c4 to challenge the centre. e4 is a bit more likely to signal the intention of a kingside attack, whereas c4 you're more often looking for queenside activity. But just to say, with this, with playing c6 rather than c5, I think what Ray is signalling is the desire to kind of hold the centre. If you play c5 and then moves like d4, you end up with this very double-edged game where White is typically attacking on the king's side and Black's attacking on the queen's side. But Black hasn't quite declared his hand in this case. He's just sort of staying neutral on that. Bishop d6, rook e1, Black castles. So Black's just doing sensible things here and developing harmoniously. Now, White plays h3. I think this is the engine move. Just starting to push this bishop around, and you can take on f3. It's really a matter of taste. Black chooses to back off and maintain the tension. b3, so looking to develop the bishop, again in a fianchetto in a kind of very modernist style. Ray's critical of this move, and you can see why, because basically Black's idea is to play pawn d4 and just blunt that bishop so the bishop's got nowhere to go. The rook comes to e8, giving it a bit more life and just defending the e-pawn. White develops on b2, and then straight away we get d4. So now Black has locked the centre, which may give White more attacking chances on the king's side, but those attacking chances are greater with the bishop on c1. That bishop's quite important in terms of kingside attacks. For instance, it can be sacrificed on h6 if there's a pawn there. So now the bishop's moved, Black may fear a kingside attack slightly less. These are very subtle nuances, but at this level, that's what we're into. A3 from white. Now, black has basically decided to start to generate activity, or threaten to generate activity, on the queen side. So we're expecting moves like c5, b5, maybe even aiming for c4 at some stage, although that would need to be defended by maybe the knight b6 or rook c8. Knight f1, so white starts feeding pieces through to the king's side, trying to generate an attack there. And here we see black continuing on the queen's side, white's going on the king's side. So now each player has chosen his own sphere of influence. Bishop g6 is really the only move. I mean, you can take twice on g4, but it sacks a piece for 2 pawns. And then here comes the knight feeding through. It's got some juicy squares like f5. Black is doing something similar, getting pieces to the king's side to defend. And black's very solid on the king's side. I mean, that bishop on g6 is a great defender. Black hasn't compromised his pawn structure. So black's very solid. And now white does redeploy that bishop through c1, maybe to aim for a kingside attack. But, you know, that's taken 2 moves. Wasted 2 tempi in a sense. Centralising that knight now, so it's really nice on e6. It can think about moving to f4, but it's just defending a whole bunch of central and kingside squares. White jumps into f5. The bishop backs off, so black doesn't want to exchange bishop for that knight, and white just slightly improves the position of the bishop. I mean, maybe preventing bishop a5 hitting the rook, and then bishop c3, which would actually be very awkward and would take away a lot of squares within the white position. I think that was probably the idea of bishop d2. So black now starts to centralise his knight. There's a little bit of sort of bluff going on here, a little bit of chicken going on, as the players are debating which side of the board they will be active on. But now the knight has withdrawn, white plays h4. So of course white couldn't have played h4 with the knight there, because the knight takes on g4. So now that knight's withdrawn, it allows h4. Black plays h5, not allowing those pawns to really roll. White defends it, but black exchanges. So all of a sudden we can see the king side is opening up, which suggests there's going to be real hand-to-hand fighting there. It's going to be a really open game. Black drops the knight into this lovely square on f4. White can take it, but then black has a pawn getting closer to the king, and also increases the scope of the bishop, which, as we'll see later, becomes important. White's knight's moving into threatening position, so it's very, very sharp now, and it's become a very interesting game. The black knight just comes to defending the bishop, defending h7, just sort of firming things up on the king side, really. And then white chooses, now black's gone to the king side, white chooses to open on the queen side. I think this is a key theme in this game, is the sort of alternating theatres of play. And they always say a really good chess player is one who can play on both sides of the board. So now black is challenging the knight on g5 because it's attacked twice. So white's taking here, and then black takes twice on g5. So we're equal in material, and now I would say black has the upper hand, or certainly is creating threats on the king side. I mean, straight away that bishop's pinned. So white breaks the pin by putting the knight in the way. But the black queen comes to a really threatening position. So once a queen gets this close to the king, it's really important to look out for combinations on every single move. I mean, black's not creating critical threats quite yet, because white has 2 minor pieces they're defending. So black can't really create a checkmate on the king's side, but it's certainly a cause for concern that the queen gets that close to the king. White chooses to annoy the black rook, and the black rook responds by sacrificing itself. So rook e6, this is a really positional sacrifice, really creative idea actually, and very sound idea. The engine really likes this. So white accepts, but what this does is it takes away white's control of the light squares. It opens the f file. It gives the king a square on f7. It basically allows a lot of attacking possibilities, and black has got rid of that bishop which was part of the defence of the king's side, basically by just putting the rook in the way. So now white starts to swap off pieces, because once you've got a material advantage, swapping off pieces is always helpful. So white's swapping off pieces and taking away that knight. I mean, clearly, for instance, if black had two moves now, I mean, it's white's move, but if black had two moves, black could go queen h3, queen g2, which is checkmate. So that knight has to go, really. And the white knight jumps here. Now, at this point, actually, really surprisingly, at this point, black's just won. So the engine just sees this game as impossible to save for white. Actually, knight f1 was viable here, but it's very hard to see. The big problem after knight h1 is, I mean, they do say you shouldn't put your knight on the edge of the board, or you shouldn't put your knight in the corners. I mean, that's a very rough rule. People break that all the time. For instance, black in the two knights defence, or the Yugoslav variation of the King's Indian defence. I mean, it's frequently a rule that's broken. In the Grunfeld, in lots of lines, it happens. But putting your knight in the corner is a bit exceptional. There's a brilliant Kasparov game where he plays the King's Indian, and he puts his knight on h1 to take off a rook on f2 that's pinned by a queen. We'll do that sometime. It's pinned by a queen. So, of course, it sometimes works in special situations, but it's a bit of an alarm bell, frankly. So knight h1, bishop here, hitting the queen, and I think as white you get really nervous here because the bishop is coming into a really good square. It's doing it with tempo. Yeah, this looks really tough for white. And now rook f8. So there's some rook lifts in the air. The rook could go to g6 or h6 via f6. This is all happening quite quickly, and of course it would come to g6 with check. So white also starts moving his rook into a defensive posture. Rook f6, rook f2, but instead of coming to g6, the rook comes to h6. And then it's very natural here to play queen e2. The idea being to defend. You know, the idea is, well, if you can defend across the second rank, then nothing can get to you. You just move that rook across, defend it all. The rook's always defended by the king and the queen, so there can be no problem. Queen e2. Now, it might be worth pausing for a second and just trying to find the problem. So this is a beautiful artistic finish. This is the reason we all love chess. So what is black's next move? If you were playing black, what would you play? Feel free to pause the video, perhaps you've already seen it. The move is queen takes that knight in the corner on h1. The king has to take, there's no other legal move. And then bishop f3 double check. So when it's a double check, you can't block and you can't take either of the pieces because the other piece is still checking. So the only legal move is king g1. Rook h1 checkmate. What a beautiful finish. And of course the rook on f2 is part of the problem for white, which is so irritating. So a fantastic game by Ray. Strategically very interesting, and lots of strategic complexity here as there was the debate around who's attacking on which side. Theoretically, great opening. I think this line with the pawn on c6 and d5, bishop g4, knights on d7 and the bishop on d6 is a really good line against the King's Indian attack. It's very frustrating for white to play against. And of course, just a beautiful tactical finish. So thank you to both players for creating a great game. And we'll do another one of Ray's soon. I'm going to go back and watch the Candidates Tournament. The commentary by Magnus Carlsen, David Howell and Tanya Sechdev is fantastic. And it's such a privilege to watch. But I'm sure you've all switched off the Candidates and you're watching Chess with Simon instead. Look after yourselves. I'll see you soon.